Thanks for tuning in to my dental hygiene mini lesson. My passage included and made reference to the anatomy of the tongue, more specifically the dorsal and lateral posterior surfaces. One of my 5 learning outcomes was that upon completion of this lesson, students will be able to identify the dorsal and lateral posterior surfaces of the tongue. In my backward design steps, first we have step 1, the learning outcome, which I've just stated. And again, upon completion of this lesson, students will be able to identify the dorsal and lateral posterior surfaces of the tongue. Next, we have step 2, the evidence. I will have my students provide this evidence by correctly labeling as well as defining the dorsal and lateral posterior surfaces of the tongue. My rationale for this evidence is quite simple. By having the students define and label the dorsal and lateral posterior surfaces of the tongue, then they should be able to successfully identify these surfaces. In sample assessment 1, I have provided a matching format. I will expect my students to define these tongue surfaces simply by matching the terms of the definitions. So as you can see here in the left-hand column, I have provided the terms. And in the right-hand column, I have provided the definition box with possible answers. So going back to the left-hand column, let's take a look at number 1, lateral posterior surface. You are now going to go to the definitions box. Look at the options that I have provided, and I've listed 4, A, B, C, and D. And you should come to the conclusion that D, side of the tongue, is the best answer. Going back to the left-hand column, let's take a look at number 2, dorsal surface. You're going to go back over here to the definitions box. Take a look at the options, and you should come to the conclusion that B, top of the tongue, is the best choice. Going on to sample assessment number 2, you will see that I have provided an image of the tongue here. Now that we have defined these terms in sample assessment number 1, we can now label them by drawing an arrow pointing to and touching the dorsal and lateral posterior surfaces. So we'll move on down to the image here. Now that we know that the dorsal surface means top of the tongue, you will draw an arrow somewhere here and off to the side label it dorsal surface. And for the lateral posterior surfaces, you can see from the image here that there is a right and left side, and you will label those accordingly. And below the image here, you can see that I have cited and provided a resource for my image. So how will I get my students there? I will do this in step number 3 of my backward design by providing several learning activities. I will expect my students to, number 1, study and memorize the diagram of the tongue that I have provided here. Number 2, read and learn the definitions of the dorsal and lateral posterior surfaces of the tongue. Again, I have provided the terms along with the definitions. As you can see, dorsal surface means top of the tongue. Lateral posterior surface means side of the tongue. Lastly, I will have students practice identifying these surfaces on each other in clinic. So with all of these learning activities, I feel confident that students will reach mastery of this learning outcome. And again, as you can see here, I have cited and provided my resource for this image. In conclusion, why is it important to identify the dorsal and lateral posterior surfaces of the tongue? It is important because it plays a critical role in identifying the many clinical manifestations of any given disease.